Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 18th of February 2025. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on the show this evening. Thanks for taking some time out of your Tuesday. And tonight, of course, I have Leith on, and we're going to talk about economics, the RBA decision, but also some broader issues too, because, of course, the real question, hence the title of the show, are minor rate cuts really going to solve the economic conundrum that we have around the place at the moment? Just before I bring Leith in, let me just remind you that we don't provide specific financial or legal advice. It's the general conversation only. We moderate the chat, but feel free to throw your comments and questions in. I won't necessarily follow everything that goes on in the chat because there's so much that goes on. But if you would like to get a question to me or Leith, if you use that Walk the World, that'll make sure it pops up in my queue. And I've also enabled Super Chat, which means you can get your questions top of the list or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here. Always greatly appreciated. We do this not for profit, but because we think there's a really, really important conversation to be had, especially at the moment. Leith, I'm going to bring you straight in now because there's so much to talk about. Welcome, welcome.
Yeah, g'day, Martin. Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me on again.
It's great to have you back. We I think had a chat just before Christmas, and of course now we are in election fever. We've had the RBA rate cut, but there's some broader economic issues to talk about too. So that'll be great. Just for those who may not know you, Leith, just give yourself the normal brief introduction, if you'd be so kind.
Yeah, so currently one of the two writers at macrobusiness.com.au, chief economist there. Started that 13 years now, I think. We're into our 13th year full-time. Before that, worked 5 years at Goldman Sachs, doing their regulatory capital. Before that, worked at the Victorian Treasury as a senior economist for a year. Before that, worked at the Australian Treasury as an economist for 3 years. This is back 20 years ago now, so that's how far we've gone back. And before that, worked at my first job out of uni was at Ford Credit Automotive Finance. So I did a Bachelor of Commerce Honours major in Economics, Melbourne University, and graduate diploma applied finance and investment. That's pretty much it.
Great, absolutely. A macro business is a go-to source of information. You and David do a great job in terms of really poking the stick at the the big guys, which is great. And of course, you've got a bit of a media thing going on now with Sky and a few other things as well. So it's great to see people taking notice of what you say. Let me start with the RBA. Of course, the RBA decision. No real surprise. I think, they cut the cash rate to 4.1%. The market is still thinking significant further cuts this year. The RBA is saying, well, we're going to wait and see what the data says. But I guess they really didn't have much option given the most recent data. But of course, this does really fire the starting gun on the election, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It does. And I guarantee the two happiest people in Australia right now are probably Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and Treasurer Jim Chalmers. Because, we'll be quite honest, Labor has been trailing in the polls for months now on a two-party preferred basis. And JWS Research, which is going up in Macro Business tomorrow, they released a really good survey today, I think it was. And it showed that basically cost of living is the dominant concern with this election. So basically 80%. So when people were the survey respondents had to put down their five biggest issues, 80% of those people put down cost of living as one of the concerns. And in fact, the number one concern was also cost of living, which I think was cited by 56% of people. Following that was actually housing affordability. So, and the thing that would worry the Albanese government is that those same survey respondents also said that the two areas where the Labor government is failing the most were cost of living, number one, and number two, housing affordability. So those are the two issues that voters seem to care most about, especially cost of living streaks ahead of everything else, but followed by housing affordability. And they're also the exact two areas where they believe that Labor is failing the most. And I think Labor would be hoping that the Reserve Bank cutting interest rates and the prospect of more interest rate cuts, even though it wasn't suggested in the minutes, that they generally cut in clusters. That Labor's probably hoping that that'll turn the tide of public opinion, and it might signal to the regular punter out there that the worst of the cost of living crisis is finally over after basically three pretty hard years from when the Reserve Bank first hiked rates all the way back in May 2022, which I tell you what, it's 3 years next month. It's gone incredibly quick. I can't believe how quick it's gone, to be quite frank. And it's actually 5 years since the pandemic started, which is unbelievable when you think about it.
I know, time flies. It absolutely flies. But the interesting thing here is if you look at the data, of course, the underlying inflation was within band, well, close to band, just slightly above. But the problem there is that some of the data was also a bit weird, because effectively we've got so many government interventions and support, from electricity through to transport through to medical. You can list them all out. It's got to the point where the underlying is now being a little bit influenced by all of that intervention. So I'm not sure we know quite where the compass is, but the trajectory is clearly rates coming hopefully down later because inflation's coming down. But the point there is inflation is not reducing prices, right? It just means the rate of growth is slightly lower. And so because of that 3 to 5 years of horrendous monetary easing, money supply, all of those things, the inflation forces have lifted cost of living dramatically. And so no surprise, therefore, that for most people, I see it in my surveys, most people are saying it's really, really tough just to sort of get by at the moment. And not just people at the bottom end of the income scale, but pretty much wherever you look across the income scale, these costs are massively high. And you look at the energy costs, we'll come on to that a bit later. You look at the cost of food, school fees, wherever you look, costs are higher. And so no surprise, therefore, that this election is going to be about the cost of living. But the question I have is, does either side really have anything by way of remedies or solutions to either housing or cost of living? Or are we basically just seeing a series of announceables, a series of little credos being recited on the hope that they can convince enough people to vote in a particular way? Because I don't see either side really with strategies to solve either of these two big issues.
No, absolutely not. And to your point, it's probably worth I'll just say quickly as a side point. When economists talk about inflation falling, it doesn't mean prices are falling. All it means is the rate of growth in those prices is falling. So, for example, your rents won't rise as much as they did last year. That means that rental inflation is falling. It doesn't mean that rents are going to come down and they're still going to remain ridiculously unaffordable, because, and the same with construction costs on housing, because both rents and construction costs, asking rents and construction costs, have both increased by about 40% since the pandemic started. And it doesn't mean that they're going to suddenly go back those 40%. Like that's embedded cost now across the economy. It just means that it's going to get worse more slowly from here. So it doesn't mean it's going to necessarily get better. It's just going to get worse more slowly. And on the cost of living thing, real per capita household disposable income, which captures most of that cost of living, is actually fallen by about 8% since mid-2022, since the Albanese government came in. And that there is, that's the biggest decline in the nation's history, or in recorded history, in disposable incomes. And it's also the biggest decline in the advanced world. So Australians have been hit especially hard. And we've been hit especially hard because not so much because our inflation's been necessarily worse than most other places, but we do have a variable mortgage rate structure here. So when the Reserve Bank hiked interest rates, even though it didn't hike as far as, say, New Zealand, the increase on the borrower was greater than most other countries. So it meant that households got hit harder. At the same time, average tax rates have gone up quicker than most other countries because our tax rates aren't indexed to inflation like they are in, say, the US and a few other places. And also we had the expiry of the lower middle income tax offset, which basically lifted average tax rates for lower and middle income earners. And, so it's those sorts of things that have actually driven up the cost of living more in Australia than most other countries. And, it's quite a nasty situation we've got. And it's really the main reason why the Albanese government is on the nose. And unfortunately, I don't think the coalition is going to really make much difference, to be quite frank. Their energy policies are equally bad. Their housing policies are possibly worse. They're slightly better in immigration, but not a whole lot better. So really, you're really just trading one muppet for another. And but the coalition has the potential to coast in and make Labor the first one-term government since the Great Depression purely on a protest vote. And to be fair, that's how Labor got in last time. It was a protest against Scott Morrison, and the Liberals were long in the tooth. It wasn't because Labor was this great alternative. Their primary vote was terrible last election. It was just really a protest vote. So unfortunately, we've got two Muppet parties to vote for, and I actually think the Greens are Muppets as well. So pretty much we've got wall-to-wall Muppets to vote for. And you basically got to pick your least worst poison, or what you perceive will probably be your least worst poison. And if you end up doing what I generally do, which I always vote for minor parties, Independents and Sustainable Australia and other parties like that, but you have to preference the other party somewhere, and it tends to go to them anyway. What I always do is I tend to vote for oppositions in my preferences. So, the coalition annoyed me. I got sick of them. So I put Labor above the coalition, although a long way down the ballot list. This time I'll probably do the opposite. But in the end, you're still going to be stuck with a Muppet, unfortunately, because that's the Australian system, unfortunately.
Absolutely. And it is, of course, the case that the latest opinion polls show that the minor parties are actually significantly in a stronger position than the majors in many parts of the country. And I think that protest vote will be quite significant, but because of the transferable vote system that we have here, ultimately the votes will stick to one of the major parties eventually. And that shows you that the way the system is built, it's rigged essentially in favour of the two major parties directly or indirectly. And of course, the stuff that they did recently in terms of party funding also reinforces their ability to be able to pull the strings in a way that means they're more likely to be able to remain in power one way or the other. But if you look at policies, and the sort of the stream of policies have started to come now with the housing stuff, and we might touch on housing in more detail in a second. But the housing stuff, really neither side are wanting to have the demand side conversations. Everyone is talking about different ways of thinking about supply, or if you're the opposition, of course, then accessing super, or if you're Labor, then, those with HECS can actually now, we can look over HECS and don't worry about that. So what'll be next? Let's just write off credit card debt. That's not really debt. That's where do you end? So,
well, can I kind of say on that one, the funniest one this week we got was the property council head, who so the property council last year when the Greens Senator housing spokesman Max Chandler Mather, who I'm not a fan of, but he last year proposed doing rental caps, so capping rents. And the head of the property council was like, no, you can't do that. That's market interference. That's inefficient. That'll do this. That'll do that. I actually don't support that policy, and especially not the context of the Greens, where the Greens want to pump prime immigration even more than the two major parties. That seems pretty stupid.
Yep.
But my point was the head of the property council basically lambasted the Greens for daring to, talk about capping rents. But then that same guy in their budget, in their pre-election submission, has called to cap interest rates at 5% for first home buyers. So he wants the federal government to quote unquote use their balance sheet, i.e. subsidise the mortgage rates of first-time borrowers of, I think, actually it's not just first-time borrowers, it's other borrowers as well, but not investors, to basically cap interest rates at 5% and to allow 5% deposits for housing. So I'm like, hang on, dude, we're not allowed to cap rents, but we're allowed to cap mortgage rates, and that will effectively remove the interest rate function away from the Independent Reserve Bank. Isn't the interest rate setting process supposed to be independent of government and etc.? Yet this joker wants to basically pretend to fix affordability by capping, interest rates at 5%, and for the federal government to basically subsidise that through its balance sheet, i.e. taxpayers, and to basically, allow 5% deposits. And we all know what this is going to do to house prices if it came in. Thankfully, it never will come in. Well, actually, never say never. We're a dumb country, but I think it's unlikely. But if it did, what do you think that'll do to house prices? And you think that'll improve affordability, or do you think it'll do what all these demand side measures have done for 30 years? It's just going to push prices higher and make affordability worse in the long run. And that's pretty much the situation we've got now. We've got literally the worst affordability across virtually every measure. And I've actually put them on a chart pack side by side, all the different ways to measure affordability, and pretty much every one of them is at its worst. So this was actually, for all its places, this was published on Domain, these green charts, and they're fantastic. They're using CoreLogic data. But, the national dwelling price income ratio is at 8, or was, this is, I think, September quarter, or maybe it's the December quarter, was at 8, which was the equal all-time high. Time to save a deposit, 10.6 years nationally, which is, a whisker down from the previous peak, but basically at an all-time high. The proportion of income needed to meet mortgage repayments at a record high nationally. Proportion of income spent on rents at a record high. So Australia at the moment sucks if you're a renter or if you take on a mortgage and you have to pay off that mortgage. Like it sucks both ways. And just last week, the Australian Bureau of Statistics released its quarterly, it's now turned quarterly, housing finance data, which showed that average loan sizes have hit record highs. So they're about 680,000 nationally. That's the chart, bottom middle. And they've topped 800,000 for the first time in New South Wales. And surprise, surprise, we're at this, we've basically hit, a kind of affordability ceiling, whereby the only way you can now improve, quote unquote, affordability is by lowering interest rates, which can increase your borrowing capacity and obviously monthly repayments, or, as we're seeing, pump priming demand, which is what the latest policy brain fart of our politicians. So just this week, the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, announced that he basically told the financial regulators, actually it might have been last week, I'm losing track of time here, told the financial regulators, ASIC and APRA, that they can basically exclude mortgage student debt from mortgage serviceability calculations. And that table on the top left, this is from Mortgage Choice, but Tarek Brooker put in a nice table here, basically shows the boost to borrowing power, different income levels. So if you're an individual with an $125,000 pre-tax income, so you're, decently high income earner, this policy, by allowing you to exclude your HECS, would boost your borrowing power by 95,000. It's about boosts it by about 27,000 if you earn 75 grand. And obviously this policy, the brain fart by, the property council guy, it's just going to do what it's done for the last 20 years, which is shown in the middle chart there, the top middle, which is from Alex Joyner at IFM Investors. Basically, as household debts or as mortgage sizes have increased, so has house prices. They track almost perfectly. It's not rocket science. And effectively, what the government wants to do, and this is the reason for it, is the bottom middle chart there. There's a massive, house prices have basically risen way above what borrowing capacity should be. So they're going, well, hang on, we need to find a way to increase that capacity to pay to match the house prices and preferably push house prices higher. Because remember, Claire O'Neill, the housing minister, a couple of months ago, said that it's government policy not to let house prices fall. They want to see house prices rise, quote unquote, sustainably. And this is a policy basically to pump prime demand. And we know it's been self-defeating because, as the chart in the bottom left shows, home ownership rates have fallen for decades, amongst younger people. So, we've done 20 years or so of these first home buyer grants and all this other demand side stuff, allowed people to, raid their super at certain times, etc. All these sorts of policies have done one thing and one thing only, and it's push up house prices, and it's actually worsened the home ownership rate. And this will be more of the same. It's just going to inflate the housing bubble even more and make things more expensive and make housing affordability worse, and just absolutely stupid policy. And not to be outdone, good old potato head Peter Dutton, the coalition has committed to allowing first home buyers to use their superannuation for a housing deposit. And also he wants to relax responsible lending laws so they can borrow more. So banks can lend more to first home buyers and people and marginal borrowers who shouldn't be able to borrow, who can't really afford to borrow. And that goes against the very first recommendation of the Hayne Banking Royal Commission, which was to maintain responsible lending rules. The coalition literally wants to tear those up. So we've got clowns to the left, jokers to the right. Labor wants to, it's already announced that the not to count student debt. The coalition, the coalition will no doubt keep that policy, and then it'll throw a bit of super into the mix. It's like they've already thrown the student debt on the fire. Goes like that. Coalition goes, oh, here's a bit more petrol. We'll throw some super. You know what? Here's a bit of gasoline. We'll get rid of responsible lending laws. Yeah, massive housing bubble. And that's what we're going to get. And the only minor trade-off is both sides have committed. Well, actually, I think the policy's already come in. The coalition promised it first, then Labor copied it to ban temporary migrants from buying established homes for 2 years, which is a good policy. That should be permanent. Let's face it, but that is small beer compared to these sorts of policies. And this is what we've got here. We've got a pack of morons who just basically want to inflate the housing bubble even more. Both sides. It's just the pump priming election has begun. And unfortunately, if the RBA cuts rates and we get this sort of stuff, who knows? We could have another leg up in the great Australian housing disaster show that is Australia.
And it's fascinating to me that, people sometimes say, well, I know housing is expensive, but if I don't get in now, I'll never get in. And so there's a little bit of a sense of, I need to get in whatever it costs. And so people have taken on ever greater debt burdens to be able to get into the property market at the expense of many other things. So many people are spending half of their incomes now just to find somewhere to live. But the economic consequences of this, in terms of the lack of spending in other parts of the economy, is one of the reasons why overall momentum in the economy is pretty weak. Set that against the massive, large balance sheets of the banks, because they just go on lending more and more and more. And the more they lend, of course, the more they can lend because they chase prices higher, which means they can lend more. So you've got this amazing Ponzi scheme going on, underwritten by the government.
Yeah, and it's been going on for decades.
And that's the point. I saw Alan Kohler recently said, well, it was all down to Howard and negative gearing. Well, yeah, that was one of the factors. But you need to list out there are at least probably 20 factors over the last 30 to 40 years that have combined to create this monster that we've got. The amount of credit in the system is way higher than it was. We've got huge migration, so there's strong demand. We've got the banks with very strong balance sheets and focusing more and more on lending for mortgages rather than for business. We've got the deregulation of the financial system, which means that not only can they lend more for less capital, but also you can securitize and do all those other things. You can list again and again and again all of these things that have been in play for a generation plus. And we've got to the point now where we've got peak stupidity on prices, but it looks as though we could get another leg up even now with what the governments are now talking about and what the RBA potentially will do with lowering interest rates. Because if interest rates are going to be lowered, that increases borrowing capacity once again. And if you add in the HECS and everything else, it means that more people will be able to actually extend themselves even further. But it's not good policy, and it's not good for Australia, and it's not actually really good for ordinary households trying to make their way. That's why, of course, the average age for a first-time buyer is now 10 years older than it was a couple of decades ago. Why a lot of first-time buyers are absolutely only in the market because they can get help from the bank of mum and dad or the family bank. And why, as people now are going into retirement, still with mortgages, which means that life in retirement is going to be a bit of a problem because they've still got that mortgage to pay off. Unless, of course, they sell the property at that point and go into rented accommodation.
Yeah, it's also a reason why the birth rates collapsed, or is falling, because people can't afford to have kids when they got to service these monster mortgages, or they've been forced to live in a high-rise dog box, which is totally incompatible with raising a family. And to your point on the migration thing, like this is so Australia's basically created the perfect storm for housing and the perfect FOMO generator, so the fear of missing out generator. Right. So we do all this, all the stuff we just mentioned. But at the same time, one of the underpinnings of that, on top of that, is we keep importing loads of renters and home buyers every year through immigration at just enormous rates. And, anyone sort of hoping that the federal government's going to take the pedal off immigration is deluded. I mean, the coalition has promised a little bit less, but they still support Big Australia. And in fact, I've got a beautiful chart on the slide pack ready to go. Now, this is the bottom left chart. There is it was compiled by the SMH, but it's from December's population statement from the Centre for Population. Now, what that is, that's the Orwellian Treasury propaganda unit, basically, that promotes immigration. So it's a small sub department within the Treasury called the Centre for Population, and it basically puts out propaganda on immigration. That's effectively what it does, and does population forecasts. And the latest population statement projected that Australia's population is going to grow by 4.1 million people in the next 10 years. And the next 10 years, almost the overall majority of that population, 4.1 million, is, guess what, going to be in the major cities. So Melbourne's projected to grow by 1 million people, Sydney by 900,000, Brisbane by 500,000, Perth by 500,000. I'm not sure about Adelaide, I didn't look that up. But, this is just, can you imagine Sydney adding another 900,000 in 10 years, or Melbourne adding another million, or Brisbane, Perth, 500,000 each? This is just going to keep putting a fire hose to demand, more so in the rental market. But we know that rental affordability is already at a record low, which means it's even harder if you're a first home buyer to save for a deposit, because you tend to rent first and you got to save up to get that deposit. And it's a lot harder when your rents are going up, or your rents are super expensive. And then also, because of these credit factors, but also population growth, the prices are going up as well. So you get hit twice. So if you're a young person who's renting and you want to buy a home, you get whacked twice, because you pay more for your rents because of immigration. And then you end up paying more for your house as well if you want to buy. And it makes that deposit gap harder, because you're spending so much money in your rent, you can't afford to save up as much. And this whole demand pump priming also comes from the population side. And it's coming at the same time as Australia's dwelling construction industry, well, the housing construction industry is on its knees. And the top middle chart there shows Albo's target in the red line, and it shows, and we're against actual dwelling construction. So, Labor's committed to building 240,000 homes a year, or 20,000 homes a month. We're tracking at about 170,000. We're nowhere near that, and it's very hard to see how we're going to get near that when construction costs have increased by 40% over the pandemic. We've got structurally high interest rates. Yes, the RBA cut today, but it's very likely interest rates are going to be structurally higher than they were last decade when we had record construction. We've seen, loads of home builders go bust. I forgot to put that chart in here, but there was some ASIC's latest data on construction insolvencies is terrible. It keeps going up. We had 3,000 construction firms went broke last financial year, and in the first 7 months of this financial year, we're at 2,000 already. So more construction companies are going bust, and because they can't turn a profit, which means we've got less capacity. We've got labour shortages in the construction industry because the state governments are doing their big build infrastructure projects to try and keep up with the mass population growth, which has been foisted on them by the federal government. And as a result, they're competing with home builders for labour. So, I've literally met some builders, or former builders, who have moved from building apartments and houses to going into the big build, Victorian big build infrastructure projects, because they can earn more money and it's easier, and they get days off and RDOs and all this other crap. So, how's Australia possibly going to build more homes to accommodate this 4.1 million increase in population in a decade, which is almost a Canberra every single year for 10 years? How are they going to do it? It's just not possible. So really, when you've got a supply constrained market because of high construction costs and all these factors I've just said, the logical solution, if you want to actually make the situation not get worse, or to improve the situation, preferably, is you've got to cut immigration. You've got to cut it, and you've got to cut it hard to take the pressure off demand. But instead, the federal government, its literal forecast that came out in December, only 3 months ago, says that Sydney's going to add 900,000 in next decade, Melbourne 1 million, Brisbane 500,000, and Perth 500,000. Well, we're going to have constant problems in the rental market and constant problems for house prices if we keep importing new demand into the housing market at such a furious rate every year. And the other problem with it is, Martin, it means we're also going to have to live in high-rise shoeboxes. I've got some more data here. This is a beautiful segue. The ABC actually did a pretty good report. They're the two graphics on the left, top and bottom. It showed that the left bottom one there shows that the growth in apartment supply since the 2006 census. So, we've had nearly 60% growth in apartment stock across Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane since the 2006 census versus 22% for houses. And the top graphic there shows that almost all of those apartments have been high-rise shoeboxes because we've only built under 15% of them had 3 bedrooms or more. So building this sort of high-rise ticky-tacky shoeboxes to accommodate this population surge. And in fact, that's the middle top graphic I've put here. This came from the New South Wales Productivity Commission last year, where in order to meet the Albo's housing targets, they suggested higher towers with smaller apartments, micro apartments, fewer car spaces, smaller balconies, no rooms without natural sunlight, etc., to bring down building costs, to build smaller apartments so that we can build more of them to accommodate the growing population. Now, I put the graphic on the right there, top right, of that building with the bollards around it. Now, that there is Mascot Tower. That was built last decade, and there's Opal Tower, and there's a whole bunch of other, examples. That tower was evacuated because of crappy building code, crappy construction quality, had massive defects. It got evacuated. Opal Tower was the same. According to the New South Wales state government's own survey, about 60% of apartment buildings that were built in the last 5 years had serious faults. And the brainiac solution here, rather than slowing down immigration to a sensible and sustainable level, the government wants to basically build tons and tons of high-rise shoebox apartments for future Australians to live in. That's not really the future we want. And I've used this chart before, the middle bottom one on Sydney's dwelling composition. That there is the Urban Task Force forecast, came out about 5 years ago. And they said by 2057, Sydney's housing stock will go from over half detached houses to only 25% detached, whereas apartments will grow from 30% of Sydney's housing stock in 2016 to 50% by 2057. Well, there's the death of the Australian dream, isn't it? We're going to basically force future residents of Australia, and especially Sydney, because it's so landlocked, to live in high-rise dog boxes just so Sydney's population can grow to 8 million plus. Like, why? Why are we doing this? And just one final nail in the coffin. We keep getting told we've got to build these high-rise apartments for affordability reasons because it'll bring down costs. The cost of building an apartment is more than building a house. So Michael Matusik created that chart. It's actually about 6 months old, and I think it's actually worse than that now. But 6 months ago, the ABS data showed that it was more expensive to build. It cost about $600,000 to build a high-rise apartment, or about $600,000 to build apartments in Australia. Significantly more than it costs to build detached houses. So you can see that on the left-hand pane, the blues apartments, reds houses, and then the breakdown of apartments on the right. So if it costs so much to build these apartments and it costs way more than houses, who thinks these apartments are going to be affordable? They're not. They can't be. So we're going to have $1 million 2-bedroom dog box apartments built across some major cities, at least $1 million to live in a shoebox. Is that progress? I don't think it is. I think that is death of the Australian dream. Why are we doing this? But this is the policy of our national government. It is literally the policy of the Australian Treasury. Centre for Population, Australia's population is going to grow by 4.1 million in the next decade. And the Intergeneration Report says that over the next 38 years now, we're going to grow by 13 million people. Like, we're going to grow by Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane in the next 38 years to 40.5 million people. Well, it means we're going to live like this, because that's the only outcome. When Melbourne gets to over 9 million people, and Sydney's at about eight and a half or so, and Brisbane's at 4.5, and Perth's at 3.5 or whatever, you're going to have, especially in Sydney and Melbourne, you're going to be living like this in these shoeboxes. Why? So
Yeah,
stupid.
yeah, and add the build to rent thing over the top, right? Because that's the other factor in all of this, that the government's now given bigger tax breaks to enable large international companies to come in Australia and effectively erect high rise directly for the rental sector. Again, at high cost. That chart that you showed is part of the problem. The other side of it, of course, is all the analysis suggests that the bulk of those will actually not be affordable. So they will actually be quite expensive, because that's how they get a bigger rental premium when they actually lease them. So you can see how broken this whole thing is. And it's based on a couple of fundamental fallacies. The first is that people want to live high rise, when all the research says, well, no, people are forced to live high rise. The second is that nobody thinks about the infrastructure requirements to be able to make all this work. More people means more power, more water, more traffic. That's not being factored into the thinking. And then the third issue, which is the big one overall, we've touched it on several times in recent shows, migration. Migration is driving this. This massive flood of people means that they're running around in ever decreasing circles trying to find anywhere for people to live. But in so doing, they're completely changing the character of pretty much every major city and regional centre across Australia. And who are the winners? The winners are potentially some of those in the construction industry, particularly those with large portfolios of land that they've banked and property that they've banked. Jason made the point also, and I think this is a very important one, that there's actually a lot of questions about the profitability, right? And also, what about the issue of vacancy? So again, Jason makes the point that they've emptied out many public towers in Victoria, actually in Melbourne, left empty for years. So there's 1.2 to 1.3 million vacant properties, according to the recent census that was done, which suggests to me that we're not actually thinking about this very smart at all. We're just throwing stuff up that actually is going to be very bad to live in. It's going to be very expensive to build. It's going to be very costly for people who choose to live in this environment, socially as well as economically. And yet, well, why are we doing it?
Yeah, and the cautionary tale here is Vancouver in Canada. So Vancouver has completely transformed over the last 30 years. It's turned into an absolute high-rise metropolis. I've written about it on my blog. You can Google Vancouver on macro business. I've written about it before. And, basically for the last decade or so, about 80% of new dwellings in Vancouver has been high-rise apartments, or, apartments, but mostly high-rise. And, you'd think, if you believe the Yimbys and the Peter Tulips of the world, they'd say, well, that's great. More affordable housing, people living where they want to live and blah, blah, blah. Vancouver has the most expensive house prices and the most expensive rents in North America, and really in the Western speaking world. So in the English speaking world, I should say. So Vancouver is really the cautionary tale. Here's a place that has built high-rise shoeboxes everywhere. Like pretty much almost all new dwellings built in Vancouver have been high-rise shoeboxes. And yet its prices are absurd. It's more expensive than anywhere else in North America, and its rents are more expensive than anywhere else in North America. So doesn't that tell you that it's not really the solution? And, are they better off? I don't think they are. I mean, I'm not Canadian, but if I had to compare Melbourne at the turn of the century, where we had 3.5 million people, to now, and every Melbourneian I speak to who's about my age, I'm 47, who grew up then and, remembers it, or anyone who's older than that, just about everyone says that Melbourne was way better back then. Like easy to get around, good, affordable, you could buy a house, all this sort of stuff. Now it's just like congested. It's actually dirty now, Melbourne. It's a lot of graffiti and just crime and all that sort of stuff. That's another thing. But, and then my kids, I've got a 17, well, about to turn 17 next month, and a 14-year-old. What do they got to look forward to? I'll be the banker mum and dad for them, but if they didn't have me, what do they got to look forward to? Renting a shoebox. Great. Probably in a much crapper suburb than I grew up in and where I live currently. So,
Yeah.
it's just, unfortunately, every generation is just worse off than the one before now. And that's just, that to me is sad.
And the point I want to underscore that there are social consequences of all this. And you mentioned crime. And certainly some of the analysis that I've done recently shows that where you've got high degrees of financial stress, where you've got financial pressures on people, violence is higher. More generally, crime is higher, divorce rates are higher. So there are social consequences for all of these bad decisions. And it's interesting, Frida van Onselen, Leith,
My
said,
mum.
yeah.
Hey, mum.
Builders will most probably take on home renovations instead of building new homes. I know one who has done this. I think that's a good point too. So, builders may just give up and say, well, I'll go and do other things.
I've got a fan.
Very good. Now, one of the other interesting questions, of course, which is, well, what do we do about it, right? And we've spoken on many previous shows about this high migration problem and the fact that you can't mesh the number of people coming into the country with the limited supply of properties unless you do things very differently. And so I've argued quite often that some of this stuff about vacant buildings should be thought about. But surely we should be dialing back migration to a sensible level. Now, there was a bit of noise a couple of years ago from the opposition saying, well, we're going to actually address migration. But it seems to me that that's gone away a little bit ahead of the election. So both sides do seem to be still accepting big Australia as the policy, which of course is still Treasury's fundamental philosophical starting point, isn't it?
Yeah. And look, I'll be honest with you, the pressures for big migration are huge. So, I've mentioned it before, there's huge vested interests, which obviously like big migration. So you got the usual suspects: big business, big property, the education industry now. I call it an industry. Universities, the private colleges, the migration agents, all the hangers on who basically clip the ticket and make revenue, make money out of international students, etc. They're part of it. They all push for big migration, and it's easy to see why. Self-interest, right? Big business loves big migration because it means that they can constantly grow the domestic economic base. So if you're a Harvey Norman and you make your crust by selling white goods and all imported junk, but selling imported junk, it's a lot easier to grow your revenues every year when your population is growing by 2% than it is with a stagnant population. So they love it. More people, more revenue. It also means more competition for workers as well, so they can put mild downward pressure on wages, especially in certain areas. But the biggest shadow lobbyist, I should say, it's hard to call them a lobbyist because it's actually part of the government, but it's the Australian Treasury.
Yeah.
The Australian Treasury, and I worked there for 3 years, and I'll call them out. The Australian Treasury loves high immigration, and it loves it for multiple reasons. First of all, it makes the economy look better than it is, right? So it's an easier sell if you're the treasurer. Australia, just look at the last couple of years, we've avoided a technical recession, but we've had a per capita recession for 7 consecutive quarters. So per person, we've gone backwards for 7 consecutive quarters, which is the longest continuous decline in modern history, or in modern records dating back to the 1970s. But we've avoided technical recession because we've had this mass migration. Population's grown faster, significantly faster than the economy's grown. So per person, we've gone backwards, but it looks okay. But the bigger thing that the Treasury loves is high migration is great for the federal budget, because the federal budget collects 82% of the nation's taxes. It was 82% a couple of years ago. It's just 80%. Maybe it's changed a bit. And it collects that primarily through personal income tax and company taxes. And basically, the more people you import as migrants, most of them will work. So therefore, you get a direct increase in your tax revenue through personal income taxes. It's a 1-for-1. And also companies can grow their profits a bit more as well. So you get the company tax hit. Problem is, the costs of population growth aren't borne by the federal government. So they bear a few of them, but not much. Most of the costs are then shunted onto the states and the local governments and the private citizens. So the reason why I say private citizens is The state governments are required to provide, most of the infrastructure, schools, healthcare services, all that sort of stuff is the state government's remit. And the state government can't afford to provide all this stuff for the growing population. So what do? They end up selling everything. So they privatise everything. They sell off for some quick money to then recycle it back into other, new infrastructure, etc. Through public-private partnerships, which are basically other forms of privatisation. And what's ended up happening is, especially if you're a resident of Sydney, it's the most obvious because but it's the same in Melbourne and other places. You end up going from the turn of the century when Sydney had 4 million people, before the big migration boom, you had like 2 toll roads in Sydney. You had the Harbour Bridge and Tunnel. I call that one toll road. You had the one near the airport. I can't remember what that was called. But then fast forward to now, you've got Sydney's the most tolled place in the world. It's got like a dozen or so toll roads. And it's had to continually build these toll roads to keep up with its high population growth. And the only way the state government could afford it was by selling everything and then also doing these, basically letting Transurban build these toll roads everywhere, or selling roads to Transurban who then tolls them. So now the upshot is that if you're a Sydney-sider, you're so much worse off because at the turn of the century, you could drive around Sydney and basically not pay tolls. You had less traffic as well because you had less population. Now it takes you longer to get everywhere. And then you end up paying so much more to go anywhere because you're now going to pay Transurban a toll, which is basically a private tax, right? So, and this is replicated across everything. If you want to go to the land titles office and get something, that's been privatised. So you got to pay more for that. You pay more for everything now. And we pay more for electricity and energy and everything because we've privatised. The state governments have sold off everything, just about. And they've done it because they needed money. And one of the reasons why they needed money is because we've had this mass population growth and they haven't been able to fund it. The only way they've been able to fund it is by selling everything off. And it's a short-term gain. It's like going to cash converters and paying your bills by taking your TV and your couch and everything else to cash converters. And then you end up renting it back. So you're worse off. And that's effectively what we've done. But the federal government doesn't care about that. The federal government collects the extra tax, or extra personal income taxes, the extra company taxes. They're laughing. They love big migration because it helps the federal budget, but it stuffs the state budgets, and the state budgets then push it onto you and me through user pays charges and everything else. So we're worse off. And then don't get me started on all the other problems we've got. Like the next drought comes, where's the water supply going to come from? We've got just before the pandemic in 2019, Sydney ran incredibly low of water, right? So that was 2019. What's going to happen, according to the Centre for Population's forecasts, when Sydney's population is about 1.2 million, so adding 900,000 from now, it'll end up being about 1.2 million more than it was the last drought that hit. Well, that's 1.2 million more water users who need water. Well, where's that going to come from? Right. So this is the problem. The policymakers don't think about this stuff. They just keep funneling more and more people into the country and they don't think about it. And then at the same time, they want to go, net zero. We're going to magically get our emissions down to nothing by 2050, which is the biggest crock ever anyway. And I think it's self-defeating and harmful. But, leaving that aside, how are we going to do it when by 2050, or according to Generation Report's projections, the population is going to grow by 50% over the next 38 years or so. Like that's 50% means 50% more people doing stuff that creates emissions, more consumption, more waste, more everything, more energy use. And we're going to magically grow a population by 50% over the next nearly 40 years and then magically get our emissions down to zero. Like this is just ridiculous stuff. It's fantasy. And I tell you what, it's going to be a lot harder to meet those net zero targets if you care about that sort of stuff with a rapidly growing population than a stable population. That's just logic.
Yeah, and if you actually sort of line all these things up, so high migration, the question of energy supply, which of course is put huge pressure on households directly because of the particularly the East Coast issue with the lack of gas reservations. We know that those costs of living are going through the roof. In Sydney, again, my surveys show a lot of people in the western suburbs are paying a lot of money each month just to get around through the toll roads that seem to be absolutely everywhere. And so that's an extra cost that, of course, is being carried, by the private citizen. And, the old adage of you'll own nothing and be happy. Well, more and more, it's pay as you go, wherever you go, whatever you do, however you go. But what it means is that essentially households are picking up the bill at the end of the day for these bad policies that have
somebody's got to pay.
Yeah.
Somebody has to pay at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I always remember a speech being given by an investment banker who made the point that ultimately there are only one sector of society that end up paying, and that is ordinary people. Because at the end of the 100%. Day, they are at the bottom of the pyramid. So, however the money flows, ultimately it flows out of the pockets of ordinary households and ordinary people to keep this edifice going. And for me, that's a really, really important observation, because what it basically means is that we end up paying for all of this stupidity, right? All of these bad decisions over many years. Politicians, of course, have a final time with, the way that they actually can fund their own lifestyle and everything else through what they do, and great superannuation, etc. But ordinary people are paying, both in terms of just financial, but also more broadly social, for these bad decisions that have been taken. And yet, coming back to the election, neither side of politics wants to actually talk about any of this stuff. Both of them want to just keep the perpetual motion machine going a little bit longer, at least for the next 3 years, to be able to actually get back in power and do what they want to do. It's astonishing, but true, that these broad, important issues are hardly being debated ahead of the election, which they should be. This is critical stuff.
Yeah. And to be honest with you, look, if I had to choose a country for Australia to model itself on, I don't necessarily mean socially, no, but I mean in terms of, tax policy and all this sort of stuff, I'd definitely choose Norway. And the reason why I choose Norway is Norway has become incredibly rich, and it's got a incredibly high standard of living. And it's done so by doing two things fundamentally different to Australia. So the first one is Norway, like Australia. So Australia's rich in everything except for oil, right? We've got oodles of, coal, natural gas, iron ore, lithium, nickel, basically everything the world needs other than crude oil. We don't have much of that. But, Norway, by contrast, has, it's obviously depleting, but massive oil and gas reserves, right? That's pretty much their natural wealth. And they did it very differently to us. So when the North Sea, gas was discovered, etc., the Norwegian government was smart, and they basically kept most of the companies that drill and mine for that and then sell it in government hands. So what it means is that the Norwegian owns that and they get the profit from it. But even the private ones, private operators that run there, they get taxed at like 80%, right? So they get taxed at enormous rates. And so what Norway's done is it's effectively got all the profits from, their oil and gas sales, which they sell to the rest of Europe, etc. And it's gone to the Norwegians, but instead of just, wasting it, they've then invested that in a future fund type thing called a sovereign wealth fund. And unlike our future fund, it's ginormous, and it actually invests outside of Norway. And the reason why it invests overseas is so it doesn't drive up the Norwegian currency, right? So this sovereign wealth fund is now worth about $310,000 US per Norwegian resident. It is so that, like, they could literally stop selling oil and gas tomorrow and they'd be rich forever, because they just live off the investment returns. And Norway is the biggest shareholder of Microsoft and other companies like that. This sovereign wealth fund. And the other thing they do, because they've got this massive mineral wealth, which they've actually got benefit from, they use the bounty of that, the dividends and everything, then to pay for hospitals and schools and all this other stuff, right? And actually Qatar does a similar thing with their Qatar's the third biggest gas exporter, we're the second. And the Qataris pay basically no income tax, they get a dividend, they get free everything, cheap energy, everything. So that's run for the benefit of them as well. But back to Norway, the other thing Norway does is, because it's sitting on this massive endowment, it doesn't run a high immigration policy on purpose. And because it makes absolutely no sense. Like if you've got a sovereign wealth fund that's worth 310,000 US per resident, the last thing you want to do is be growing your population by 2% every year. Because if you do that, you then dilute your wealth, right? Because it's a fixed, the fund's a fixed amount. So if you've got more people, you got to split that pie up amongst more people every year and everyone gets poorer. What do we do in Australia? We do the complete opposite. We don't tax our resources properly. Like, yes, we do get revenue from it through company tax primarily, and there's a bit of state resources and stuff, but we don't get nearly enough. But then what we do get, we then moronically water down by running a mass immigration policy, right? So Australia is rich because of our fixed mineral endowment. That's fundamentally why we're rich. It's not because we're a smart country or anything. We just got tons of resources, right? But this century, we've grown our population by 8.5 million people through immigration. So do you think that's made us richer? Because we've got the same resource base as we would have had with 20 million people. We had 19 at the turn of the century. Now we've got 27 and a half. We've grown our population aggressively and we've effectively diluted our mineral base because we still get the same amount of, federal budget tax revenue through company tax and state royalties and stuff. But we've got to share that amongst more people, which means we get less. So we don't tax our resources properly like Norway does, but then we dilute what we do get through high immigration. This is like, to give an analogy, can you imagine, your parents pass away and it's like, you and two siblings. So you got three of you rock up for to get your inheritance, right? And then you find you got a fourth long lost brother or sister comes in. You didn't know existed. It's like, well, then your inheritance gets split 4 ways instead of 3. That's basically what Australia's doing. We're growing our population like a science experiment. By the 2062-3, according to the intergenerational report, we're going to be 40.5 million people. Well, we're going to divide our mineral wealth amongst 40.5 million people rather than 27.5 or rather than 19 million at the turn of the century. Do you think that's going to make you richer? And at the same time as we're doing this, we're now trying to basically wean Australia off from selling our resources overseas, right? Well, that's great, but what else are we going to sell? Because we've made energy super expensive. We've created a manufacturing sector. We've got the smallest manufacturing share in the OECD. I've got a chart to show it. Manufacturers are shutting down left, right, and centre because of high energy costs, because we've shot ourselves in the foot there. So unfortunately, like it or not, Australia earns a crust in the world primarily by selling its fixed mineral endowment resources. That's the way it is. That's the way it's going to be for a long time. And then we dilute that wealth by importing more and more people every year and then creating housing shortages and all this other stuff. It's just stupid. And just on the manufacturing thing. So I mentioned that we've got the smallest manufacturing share in the OECD. About 5% of our economy is manufacturing. That's the worst in the advanced world. It continues to shrink because, I'm a Victorian, right? Victoria used to have the second cheapest electricity in the world because we had unlimited brown coal. We effectively have about 1,000 years of the stuff, right? And our forebears were smart to build a few coal-fired power plants where all the coal is, so they can basically just shovel this free brown coal that has no value. It can't be traded. It's not tradable into this thing and basically creates very cheap electricity. We used to have the second cheapest electricity in the world. And as a result, Melbourne or Victoria was the manufacturing hub of Australia because it had cheap energy. Now we've decided to give that up, right? We've decided to basically give up our cheap baseload energy that we've had forever in favor of unreliable intermittent renewables, right? Which are very expensive because it costs a ton to build out the transmission to create these things, and they only work when the sun shines and the wind blows, and then you have to build tons of storage. Snowy Mountain pumped hydro, $12 billion project, started out at $2 billion, now it's 12. It's probably going to end up at 20. Like, all this stuff costs a ton of money. It just gets capitalized in your energy bills, right? So we've decided to give up our cheap energy. We've then, if you're going to, as a result, we've seen some major manufacturers shut down in the last couple of years. So in 2022, the major fertilizer company Incitec Pivot closed down because of high energy costs. So they're gone. Now we've got to, more reliant on imported fertilizer into a country that is an agricultural country. How dumb can you get? Last year, Australia's last plastics manufacturer, Queenos, shut down due to high energy costs. Now we've got to import it all from China. So, Albo wants to build his windmills with his future made in Australia. Well, where's the plastic going to come from? We don't even make that stuff anymore. Just last week, Australia's last architectural glass maker, Oceanic Glass, which built the windows for Parliament House, Canberra, shut down because of cheap Chinese imports and high energy costs. They're gone. So manufacturing keeps shrinking. We keep becoming more and more reliant on imports. And all we're doing is, so we've decided we're going to close down our, old school hydrocarbon based, cheap, reliable, was cheap and was reliable power for intermittent renewables. Well, if you do that, it's going to be expensive, but if you do that, you need a backup for when the wind doesn't shine and the sun doesn't blow. The sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow. And the firming power that you're meant to use is gas, right? But guess what? We've engineered a gas shortage because nearly 3/4 of Australia's East Coast gas, I've got a chart here from the RBA to show it. In our politicians' infinite wisdom, they gave the green light to export liquefied natural gas out of Gladstone in Queensland over a decade ago. That was done under the Rudd-Gillard government without any requirement for domestic reservation. The only gas exporting place in the world that has no requirement for domestic gas reservation. And automatically, about close to 3/4 of East Coast gas is now exported. Almost all that goes to China. So we export almost all of East Coast gas, although a vast majority to China. We've created a domestic gas shortage. We've pushed up the domestic price of gas, which then feeds in the electricity price. We need it for firming. And then now the BrainX solution, because we've created this gas shortage stupidly, is now import terminals have been LNG, liquefied natural gas import terminals have been built. There's one going to probably open up late this year in New South Wales. Twiggy Forrest, Andrew Forrest is building that. There's one plan for Victoria and there's one plan for South Australia. So soon, Australia, which is the Middle Eastern oil equivalent of gas, is going to be importing gas, even though we export gas, most of our gas. And all it's going to do is it's going to drive up the domestic price of gas even more than it already is, which is ridiculously high. So Australians already pay about 3 times more than what Americans pay, and they're the biggest gas exporter. Soon we'll probably be paying 5 or 6 times. Because as soon as we start importing liquefied natural gas, the price becomes the import parity price. So all this means is that we're shutting down all the coal and everything to move to renewables, and then we're going to back up those renewables with some of the most expensive gas in the world, which just means we're going to have this energy disaster where the cost of energy is just going to keep rising, gas and electricity, which just means that what little manufacturing we've got left is going to whittle down to nothing. And we're going to be left with nothing. And the federal government's BrainX solution, rather than trying to reserve our gas and saving it for ourselves rather than giving it to China, who doesn't need it because they're getting more than they need and they're actually reselling it for profit because they're also getting Russian gas now. Rather than cancelling some of those contracts and keeping them for us, they want to basically do nothing and make us gas importers. And then now Albo's BrainX solution is to spend $12 billion or so on his future made in Australia policy, which is aimed at revitalising Australia's manufacturing through government subsidies. So we're going to suddenly become a maker of windmills and bloody solar panels and all this other crap that we've got no expertise in, and so-called green hydrogen, which doesn't really exist. And that'll just mean that the only manufacturing Australia's got left is manufacturing that survives on taxpayer subsidies. It's just, what we've done to ourselves is just unforgivable. Like, we should be the richest country in the world. Right? We've got all the energy resources a country could need. Coal, gas, it's coming out the wazoo, sunlight, whatever, wind, whatever you want to call it. We've got everything. And except for oil. We're energy rich in everything except for oil. And somehow we've stuffed that up and we're going to give ourselves some of the world's highest gas and electricity prices. How can you do this? Can you imagine one of the Middle Eastern oil countries, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, whatever, Iran. Can you imagine them importing oil and making their residents pay $2.50 a litre because they've got a domestic shortage because they sell too much overseas? That's what we're doing.
Yeah, and it's worth highlighting, Leith, isn't it, that the federal government was always worried about sovereign risk. If we were to change some of those contracts, then that would be disastrous. I'm not sure that's true. And the other factor is, of course, that we've got a small number of international gas companies who effectively have us over a barrel now. And that means that the East Coast energy prices off the marginal price of gas, and that then feeds into the electricity price, which is why prices are so high. The other point, though, is if you actually re-import that gas, you've got to decompress it again to turn it back into gas, which means not only are you paying full international price, but you're also having to pay an additional premium as well. So, in fact, this is a route for even more expensive gas.
And it's really bad for the environment. So my whole view, and I'll probably get tomatoes thrown at me here, but I think Australia should burn our own hydrocarbons rather than selling it. So, if we I've got some charts here now. This is going to be controversial. I'm going to get some virtual strawberries or raspberries thrown at me about this. So my view is that what we do at the moment, I mentioned the gas thing, right? We sell nearly just under like 72% or something of East Coast gas is exported, right? Now, you lose about nearly 10% of that gas that you export in the liquefaction process because it uses tons of energy to freeze it. You got basically the LNG export terminals in Gladstone are basically giant freezers. So what they do is they get the gas and they liquefy it, which means you got to freeze it to like minus 190 or something. I don't know the exact figure to turn into liquid. So then it compresses it. You can then put it on a ship and then take it across to China. And then you got to degasify it. It's incredibly energy intensive, right? So I'd argue that we'd be better off not liquefying it, preferably, but even if you did, but using it ourselves. So rather than send it to China to then burn, why does Australia burn it ourselves? And I feel the same way about coal. We are the biggest coal exporter in the world, and we sell most of it to China, who just burns it anyway. So what we're doing is we're saying, no, we can't burn it. It's dirty, net zero, blah, 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 driving up our energy costs, where that then shuts down a manufacturing, which then just gets sent to China. So China makes it anyway, and then China burns the stuff anyway. And I'd argue it burns it in probably a much worse way than we would. And it just creates the emissions anyway. Emissions are a global problem. And I've got a chart here. This is from our world in data on the left-hand side. I wish I should have put the UK in there as well, but UK basically looks like Australia. And it shows the carbon emissions by major country. So China is the driver of the world's growth in carbon emissions. It's nearly 1/3 of the world's carbon emissions now. And if you look at that chart, you can see it's going up in almost a straight line. United States has cut their emissions. Europe's cut their emissions. Australia's had basically been flat, or it's gone down a little bit for a decade. UK's gone down. It's not on there. And here's the thing. Nearly 2/3 of the growth in the world's carbon emissions since 2000 have come from China. So while us and the Western countries like Europe and everyone are closing down the manufacturing, shutting down our old-fashioned energy for net zero, all this sort of stuff, giving ourselves high energy costs, our manufacturing is shrinking, and it's just been moved to China, who's burning the emissions anyway and creating all the emissions anyway, which is ridiculous. And China consumes 30% more coal than the rest of the world combined. That's the chart on the bottom left, right? So we're all cutting back on our coal use. And guess what? China's increasing their coal use. So the middle bottom chart there shows China's thermal power generation. So from power generation from thermal coal. Guess what? It's gone up 50% in 10 years, right? So they've increased their coal-fired electricity generation by 50% over the last 10 years. China has nearly 1,200 coal-fired power plants running, and they're building more and more every year. They're building more of them. Australia has like 18. So what are we doing here? Like we're basically shutting down everything, all the stuff that used to work where the transmission line's already built for net zero, even though we're 1% of the world's carbon emissions, while China's basically opening more and more coal plants every single year. They're actually opening up more and more coal mines. So China is actually the world's biggest coal producer. You probably don't realize this. We're the biggest exporter, but the amount they buy from us is tiny compared to what they make themselves. And the bottom right chart there is China's coal production. So they're increasing their coal production every single year to feed their own coal-fired power plants, which increase in number every single year. Their coal-fired electricity generation has gone up 50% in the last decade. They are driving the world's carbon emissions. They consume 30% more coal than the rest of the world combined. And yet we're making ourselves, not by we, I don't mean just Australia, I mean the UK and, Europe, everywhere else, are basically sacrificing themselves on the altar for net zero, while China's just doing whatever the hell it wants. And the end result is that our manufacturing across all these countries is just moving to China, and our emissions are just basically shifting to China. So again, nearly 3/4 of Australia's East Coast gas is exported. Almost all of that goes to China. China's burning it anyway. And I'd argue that it'd be more efficient if we just burn it ourselves. We wouldn't put it on a ship and transport it halfway across the world. We wouldn't have to lose as much in the liquefaction process, which is very wasteful and energy intensive. And it's so moronic now that we're going to be selling that, we're going to be liquefying our gas, losing heaps in the process because it's highly energy intensive, to send to China, while we then buy liquefied natural gas from somewhere else, which comes in through New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia, to then degasify it. So that whole process, you're going to use heaps of energy to liquefy it and then degas it, to regas it. Wouldn't it just be better if we just used our own gas? But the Greens would say, no, gas is dirty, it's fossil fuel, terrible, dirty, we can't do it. So, but it's going to be burnt anyway. It's just going to be burnt in China rather than Australia. So why not burn it here? And we're going to lose heaps of it in the liquefaction process, which we don't have to if we just did it domestically. And we're going to be importing gas anyway, which is going to be highly energy inefficient because it's had to be frozen and then regassed, when we could just use it natively here. And I feel the same way about coal. We're exporting heaps of coal to China to burn when we could just be burning our own coal. But we can't do it because of net zero. But China's grown its emissions through the wazoo by not following the same rules as us. So what are we doing here? Like, I honestly think the world's carbon emissions could be better if the developed world just used its own energy more and kept its own manufacturing going, rather than just sending that energy to China to burn and then sending its manufacturing to China to make instead. You'd certainly have less shipping miles, that's for sure. So anyway, that's my view on the matter. I think Australia has just lost the plot when it comes to energy, when it comes to net zero. I think the whole Western world has, to be quite frank. And China is just laughing its head off all the way to the bank here, because, we're all virtue signaling about how great we are on net zero, and I'm going to do this for stop dangerous climate change and all that. And yes, I want a cleaner world, I do. But all we're doing is just shifting it all to China anyway, which is probably doing it in a worse way than we would have anyway, with less controls. So what are we doing here?
And this is interesting because, of course, the alternative strategy of nuclear, which is now very much on the conservative side of politics agenda, might have worked 40 years ago. Look at French energy costs. They're still pretty good at the moment because they've got about 70% of their energy from nuclear. But to set out on that journey now with a gap of, 10, 15 years to be able to get it to work, seems to be a bit of a sort of a pipe dream, really. So it's almost like we don't want to do the obvious, sensible things. We want to do things which are, not obvious, not sensible. And who pays? We pay.
Yeah, and it's not just, but before you mentioned, you're right. You're quite right. But it goes down more than this, where you said that gas sets the marginal cost of electricity, which it does on the wholesale market. But it's worse than that, because the build out of renewables and everything, so if we shut it down all the coal, where the transmission's already built, right? It's already there. It's already sunk costs years ago, decades ago. And we build out with renewables. Conservatively, we're going to have to spend about $300 billion to build out all the infrastructure for all these, solar and wind and everything else. And unfortunately, you have to build so much more of it than you actually need if it was all working at once, because it doesn't all work at once, because the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. It's so intermittent, you need to have so much of it to make sure it's available when you need it. And you also need backup storage, whether it's pumped hydro, uber expensive to build, or batteries, uber expensive, and then they have to be replaced probably every 10 years. And also fire risk, as Monterey, California just found out. All this stuff's uber expensive. And the problem with it is, whenever they build these things, it automatically goes into the regulated asset base,
Mm.
which then gets passed on to our bills. So we're going to pay one way or another. So, if we go down this road whereby we do the renewables rollout and then we give ourselves expensive gas, we're going to get hit twice, right? We're going to get hit by the massive cost of transmission from the renewables, which then gets capitalized into our bills. Like, it'll be a charge on our bills. Like, it'll be part of your fixed cost in your bill. And then the marginal cost of your electricity is going to be very high because the gas is expensive. So you're going to get smashed twice. So even if you fix the gas problem, you're still going to end up with, you're going to have cheaper electricity than you would otherwise, but you're still going to have expensive electricity because you've still got the massive investment in the renewables. When we could just use what we've already got, right? And do some, I've already done some renewables. Like I honestly, I think the best approach now is to do no more wind and solar because we've already got assets out there, but if we're going to do any of that stuff, just do the storage side of it. So that way, the excess solar that we have during the days, we can actually store it. And, preferably you keep your coal-fired power plants running 24/7 because at the moment, under the mandatory renewable energy target, energy retailers have to buy renewables, a certain amount of renewables, right? Otherwise they get fined. So you have this situation that when the sun's shining in the middle of the day, they buy all that. And then the coal fire's got to shut down. The coal plant's got to shut down. So that makes them unprofitable. And then at night time, they've got to come back online. And then you got to run coal at night and gas and all this other stuff. It'd make more sense to keep the coal power plants running 24/7, still have your solar, but then you store the solar for nighttime. And then when you need it during the peaks and flows or whatever. And that I think would be a better solution. Have more storage to cover the renewables you already have. Because if you just keep building out more and more renewables, you're going to have a increasingly intermittent system that's unreliable because you don't know when the wind's going to blow. You don't know when the sun's going to shine. And you need to basically, we should be focusing more on the storage side, I think, now and just use what we've already got. Because it's already built, it's already there. We've got tons of coal to burn. And yes, the climate warriors will get annoyed at me and they'll throw eggs at me and, Australia might get a slap on the wrist from the rest of the world. That's, you're not meeting your commitments, all this sort of stuff. What are they going to do? We don't sell anything to the rest of the world anymore anyway, because we've got we're killing our manufacturing. The only things we sell are our natural resources now, because we've totally killed the value-added side of our economy through high energy costs. So we have to arrest that. I mean, that might actually come back to a degree. And they're going to keep buying our stuff because they need it, right? So yes, we'll be we'll take a bit of a reputation hit, whatever. But while China's doing this, and China's burning willy-nilly and driving the world's carbon emissions and increasing its coal use every year and all this sort of stuff, I don't think it makes much sense for Australia to shoot itself in the foot. Nor the UK. The UK is doing. I mean, mate, you live there, but UK is doing the same mad stuff. Mm. And now the UK, correct me if I'm wrong, doesn't have the most expensive energy prices in Europe now.
Yes, it does, absolutely. And interestingly, there's been a big stoush because steel making in the UK is shrinking. So more steel is being imported.
Shock horror, eh? Shock horror.
And guess what? The main reason? It's too expensive to essentially create steel. And if you go into the future of steel, which is sort of electric arc furnaces, that requires a huge amount of power, and that power is way too expensive, which basically means it's completely uneconomic.
So guess where it's going to go, Martin? It's going to go to China.
That's the point. So they're now importing.
China's going to burn coal to do it.
Exactly.
China's going to burn tons of coal, and it's like, well, why doesn't the UK just burn its own stuff?
And it's a fascinating.
So keep this stuff going.
And it's a fascinating situation because you have ideology that sort of cuts across common sense, and so many places it's just plain weird. And
sorry, can I just add? Yeah. This isn't a macro business view, by the way, because Dave and I disagree vehemently at this point. he like we've had a few arguments about this. He's more. He just thinks if you fix the gas side, everything fixed, right? Which is, it's obviously better. We want to fix that, but he still believes in the energy transition. We've got to shut down coal and blah 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 blah. That's my reading of the situation. I don't. My view is the one I've given now. It's not necessarily a macro business house view. I'm a bit at odds with Damien Class and David on this point.
Yeah, and it's worth saying, that none of this is simple and straightforward. But what we do know is that energy costs are too high. Energy costs at the moment are effectively degrading any manufacturing in Australia or indeed in the UK to other places. Most of it's going into places like China, etc.
Yep.
And by the way, if the tariffs from the US come in, we're going to find that more and more materials are going to come our way because we don't necessarily have the same tariff structures as perhaps the US does, which means it's going to be more and more difficult for other parts of the world to go on making things. And so we become more and more reliant on an external third party who then can, of course, can turn the wick up on the price later because we've got no choice. So it's almost like we end up being completely disabled as a country, right? And I would argue that the ransom that we're being forced to pay for energy at the moment is a failure, but it's a failure of government policy over 20 to 30 to 40 years, right? Just as housing is a failure of government policy over 20 to 30 to 40 years. So the question is, how do you change this? Well, the first thing is to recognize where we actually are. And the thing that I get so frustrated about, Leith, is that when you start looking at these issues and you start to understand how they work, it's blindingly obvious the mistakes that have been made. But of course, those in power at the moment want to sweep it under the carpet and say, no, it's something else, right? So we'll solve it differently. But the fact is that none of the policies from the politicians at the moment have any capacity to deal with these critical issues, and that's why it's really important to, one, raise the issues, and then two, perhaps talk about some of the alternatives to be able to change the agenda a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And just on the energy thing, look, I'll be honest, I care so much more about having reliable and affordable electricity above everything else, right? Because if it's a bedrock of a modern economy and a successful economy. If you don't have reliable and affordable energy, your economy's stuffed.
Yep.
And your household, like it's the bedrock. So we're not giving ourselves that. We've got unreliable and unaffordable energy. And I'm sorry, but my view is that those two things, affordability and reliability, trump virtue signaling over net zero. I'm sorry, that's my view. And I know other people going, oh, I mean, there'll be people out there who think I'm a climate saboteur or something like that or whatever. It's like, no, I just don't want to see Australian households get smashed. I don't want to see Australian businesses get smashed. I don't want to see our economy become even less diversified than it already is. And I don't want to see us ship more of our industry across to China to basically make it instead of us and to burn our own hydrocarbons that we're sending to them instead of us using our own. So it's just like, I want us to have a stable, affordable, and reliable energy system.
Yep. And that's absolutely what it should be. The other point I'd make in here in all of this is that government is scared of big business, and particularly some of these, look at the financial sector or look at the energy sector, those big corporations. So actually governments don't want to upset them and don't charge them the right amount of tax that they should be taxed, all of those things, right? Because they are really quite scared of their power to be able to actually do things. And so where it ends up is that ordinary people end up paying more taxes. So look at the proportion of tax from individuals versus corporations. It's gone the wrong way for the last couple of decades. And what it basically means is that we end up sweeping up the mess and paying the bill for governments who are not really looking after our own interests. And that's the bottom line problem with the way that politics at the moment is running in many countries, including Australia and the UK.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's very few examples that are doing it right. But again, I point to Norway is a much more sensible system, and Qatar, for a classic example, I used it before. Qatar are rich because they're the third biggest seller of gas. We're the second, and they've got a much smaller population than us, admittedly, but they tax it all right. They sort of do a Norway, and they're and the citizens benefit from it, but we're not really benefiting from our natural resource wealth. We benefit a little bit through company taxes, but state royalties are tiny, and most of it goes untaxed, and it's just crazy. Like, again, we got everything the world needs other than oil. We should be the richest country on earth, and then we dilute what little we get from it by running a high immigration policy, which is just even crazier. So we just, we do everything wrong in this country, unfortunately.
So the election should be a discussion, in my mind, about migration. Absolutely. It should be a discussion about energy strategy, properly based, not just on, oh, well, the future is nuclear in 20 years' time or whatever it is, right? So there's a really important point there. And I think there's also a very important point about what the role of government actually is, because the other side of all of this is that we seem to be expecting government to do more and more and more and more and more, and they don't do it very well. So maybe if we thought about what free market capitalism was really about, and I say free market capitalism, not the sort of messed up capitalism we got at the moment, maybe that's another angle as well, that we actually focus on investing in businesses that can actually do things, right and powerfully in areas where there is opportunity, rather than maintaining the status quo or the old modes of operation that clearly have failed. And I come to this very simple observation as we come towards the end of the show, Leith, that if we continue to play the game by the current set of rules, ordinary people are going to be taken to the cleaners over the next few years. We need a different approach, a different set of thinking to be able to take us forward. And the point is, there are alternative models out there. There are alternative ways of thinking about this, but you got to start by understanding where we currently are. And unfortunately today, thanks partly to the the social media blizzard and the way that mainstream media tell some of the stories, but not all the stories, a lot of this stuff isn't being told.
Yeah, it's the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. Right? For 25 years, I've followed this, neoliberal path, whatever, and look where it's got us. High immigration, like excessive immigration for 20 years, pretty much, and all these other policies, and we've privatized everything and sold off all our assets to corporations. And one of the reasons why I've got this energy crisis is because we used to have state-run energy systems. Well, not anymore. They're all privatized. Upstream, downstream, everything's privatized now. And, are we getting better outcomes? We're not. Everything's worse, unfortunately.
Yep.
And so somehow we've got to find a way to arrest this. But unfortunately, even if Labor loses this election, we're going to get the coalition, it'll be more of the same. It'll be Pepsi instead of Coke, right? They'll taste almost the same. There'll be, marginal differences here and there. And let's face it, most of the differences are around symbolism and virtue signaling, right? So, one of them will, Dutton will pretend to be anti-woke or something, and that'll be his thing. And, whereas Albo was the voice and everything else. But all this stuff aren't the big issues. They're basically there to distract us from the big issues. And, unfortunately, on the big issues, it's basically two sides of the same coin. So, yeah, unfortunately, I've been doing this for 13 years full time on macro business. And yeah, every time you think it can't get worse, it seems to get worse.
Yeah. Well, your closing point about insanity is doing the same silly things and expecting a different outcome, right? And that's what we've been doing for the last, 30, 35 years. And we're seeing the results coming through. The trouble is we can go around that again and again. It's not going to stop unless.
Yeah. And unfortunately, the end point, I don't want to sound, I'm not saying we're going to get there in the next 30 years, but the end point is becoming like Argentina. It used to be one of the richest countries in the world, 100 years ago or something. And it's just, Argentina and Australia were sort of tied. And now look at it. And unfortunately, if we keep sort of run by semi-corrupt idiots who run the country for their own benefit and, their mates and everything, not for the benefit of Australians, well, that's sort of the result you're probably going to end up with. Maybe not in my lifetime, but you can see that we're on that kind of path if we don't fix things.
And that's really the point, that unless we do take a different path, then the perpetuation of the current normal, quote unquote, will continue. And that is going to be, it's going to degrade Australia and Australians. We're seeing the same, by the way, in the UK as well, and other countries too, because essentially some of these critical issues that need to be addressed unfortunately aren't being addressed. Well, Leith, we've come to the end of the show. Just before we go, if people want to find out more about what you guys do, where should they go?
Yeah, so go to macrobusiness.com.au. That's where I write. And if you want to see my interviews, I do seem to do sort of 5 to 7 a week now on mostly radio, but sometimes on TV as well. Got a YouTube channel at Leith Vo. So I probably should give it a real name, but Leith Venon's my name. So just at Leith Vo. I started that as just, I've had that channel for like 15 years, but it was just as a YouTube channel to watch videos. And then I just started doing interviews. So I've started to upload all my interviews to it. And a new video goes up every day or two. I do heaps of radio these days on all sorts of topics: energy, interest rates, immigration, whatever. Like they call me up. Can we get you on? Yep. Do an 8-minute interview, put it on YouTube, etc. So if you want to watch those or stay in touch there, go to @LeithVo.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much indeed for spending some time on this Tuesday evening, Leith. Really appreciate it. And as always, you're on point with some of the critical issues. Some people won't like some of the messages, and people might come away shaking their head a bit saying, oh, it's all a bit negative. But the point is, unless we shine a spotlight on some of these fundamental issues, there's no chance of talking about them and shifting the dial, right? So the purpose of what we do here is to try and actually lay some of the foundations so these debates can actually happen. So I really appreciate that. I think you've done that today.
And to be fair, we don't have all the answers, right? But you can at least point out the obvious problems that we've got, and then hopefully smarter people than me, can come up with solutions, or at least go, yeah, that's a problem. I think this is what we should do. But if you don't highlight the problem, and we've got a clear problem with housing, immigration, energy, all these areas, it's just blatantly obvious.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Leith. I really appreciate that. And I'm going to take you offline now, and I'm going to close the show. And I'll look forward to catching up with you again. We'll put something else in the diary for a few weeks ahead, because always something to talk about.
For sure, mate. Anytime, just put up the bat symbol.
See you. Thanks for that. There you go, folks. Hope you found that insightful and challenging a little bit, perhaps, but also very, very important. Just as next week, I've got Robbie Barbic on. We're going to talk about the breakdown of the international rules-based order and try and ask the question, who set the rules? Have they been working? And what should we do about it? So that should be quite an interesting conversation, particularly, of course, with Trump and everything else going on at the moment. Just before I depart, the dogs are around. Well, Meteor's out of a basket, Luna's sound asleep, so I think it's time for their lunch. And I want to say thank you very much for spending some time with us this evening. I hope you found that interesting. We do put up recorded shows every day of the week and live on Tuesdays. I look forward to seeing you next Tuesday, and check out the other shows meantime. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Take care.